Continuing with our study of Revelation chapter 1, today we're focusing on verse 17 and 18. So in verses 12 through 16, John has just seen the vision of the exalted Christ. And so we pick up in verse 17, it says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he laid his right hand on me and said, 'Don't be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades.'" So John's response when seeing the glory of Yahweh is similar to that of Ezekiel, Daniel, and the disciples at the Transfiguration. However, John's experience seems to be even more intense, as John says that he was like a dead man, and we don't see that language in the other places that they fall down. Ezekiel threw himself to the ground. Daniel passes out and there's no strength in him, and the disciples fall down in fear. But here John says he was like a dead man. So I wonder if the intensity of John's vision was more than the intensity of what was previously witnessed by Ezekiel or Daniel or even John himself at the Transfiguration. But the response of Christ to this is he tells John, "Don't be afraid." Now, this is only spoken to his own. There are times throughout the Gospels where the disciples are afraid, and Jesus says, "Don't be afraid." The famous one being when he's walking on the water, the disciples are afraid. They think he's a ghost, and he says, "I am," which is the deity claim, and then he tells them, "Don't be afraid." Now, this does not apply to his enemies. When the soldiers came to arrest him in John 18, Jesus asked who they were searching for. They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." He said, "I am." And when he said that, they all fell to the ground. So it's my view that he unveiled just a little glimpse of his deity. And when they saw it, they fell down. He did not tell them to fear not, though, because they were in rebellion. They actually came to kill him. So it's only to his own that he says, "Fear not." He'll reveal himself, "I am," and then "fear not." And that's what we see here with Revelation 1:17. The "I am" statement does occur, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. A scholar named Jürgen Roloff had an interesting comment here. He said, quote, "The Lord of the world, to whom power over everything is given, is the same one who devotes himself to his servant with compassionate love. The hand that holds the stars gives the sign of blessing," end quote. There's a similarity here in what Jesus tells John, "Don't be afraid, I am." There's a similarity there between that statement and his statement after walking on the water, as I mentioned. In John 6:20, when the disciples see him walking on the water, he said to them, "I am, don't be afraid." So those who are serving God need not fear his presence. Robert Thomas says, quote, "The title 'I am' has a rich Old Testament background, being traceable to the origination of the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, the personal name of God in Exodus 3:14. An Old Testament link of this title with Exodus 3:14 in Isaiah 48:12, where the Hebrew text gives the self-identification of God and is represented in the Septuagint rendering of the verse by ego eimi. In that Old Testament passage, the full statement closely represents the same statement as here in Revelation 1:17. "I am the first and the last." Now, there's an interesting subtlety here in the Greek. A scholar named Montague notes that the Greek word for last is not the neuter, but the masculine, indicating that the end is not an event, but a person, Jesus Christ. As Thomas said, the first and the last is a clear reference to the self-assertion of Yahweh in Isaiah. And it occurs in Isaiah 41:4, 44:6, and 48:12. So I'm just going to read one example. I'm not going to read all of those. But Isaiah 44:6 says, "Thus says Yahweh, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts, I am the first and I am the last. Beside me there is no God." So, if you're ever in the situation when a Jehovah's Witness knocks on your door and wants to talk about Jehovah God, take them through this series of passages. Take them through Isaiah 41:4, Isaiah 44:6, and Isaiah 48:12, and have them identify who's speaking, because it's clearly Yahweh, or as they pronounce it, Jehovah. Is it thus says Jehovah, I am the first and I am the last. Okay, so that's clear. Then after going through those three, take them to Revelation and trace where the phrase occurs. I am the first and I am the last. We've seen one already in chapter 1. There's one here, and there's a couple of other ones. I think chapter 22, and I want to say there's one in the letters to the churches, and I don't have those references. It'll be easy to find. So after you take them through Isaiah, take them through Revelation, the same references where he says, I am the first and I am the last, and ask them to identify the speaker. And end with this one right here. Because what does John say? Or what does Jesus say to John? I am the first and the last and the living one. No problem so far. But then for the Jehovah's Witnesses who do not believe that Jesus is God, who don't believe that he's Yahweh incarnate, the next phrase, they don't know what to do with it. So he says, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died. Whoops. So you can ask them, when did Jehovah die? Well, Jehovah is incarnate in Jesus. Jesus is God. So if you're ever interacting with a Jehovah's Witness, you could ask them that and see what they have to say. You could also take them to the Psalms, trace back from the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, back to the Psalms, and you can have the same kind of fun stumping them. They have no answer. Yeah, hopefully, and some of them, once in a while, some of them do repent, but it seems to be pretty rare, sadly. But still, you can do that when they come to your door. So by claiming the title, the first and the last, Jesus is once again occupying the Old Testament Yahweh slot. He is the God of Israel incarnate, because he is saying, I am the first and the last, and as I said in Isaiah, I am the first and the last is what Yahweh says. So this claim of eternality also links with Jesus' descriptions as the Ancient of Days from verse 14. And just as the Old Testament prophets were commissioned by a direct encounter with the God of Israel, so is John here. And if you look at some of the prophets, it's pretty clear. I think it's made the most clear in Jeremiah, where God talks about those who stand in the council, and if you've stood in the council, you will transmit the truth of God's words to the people. Well, here John is standing in the council. The God of Israel incarnate is standing right in front of him, and John is receiving his commission, which is going to be to write the book of Revelation. So Jesus also identifies himself as the living one, the first and the last and the living one. And Ford says, quote, life is the essential property of Yahweh, who calls himself, or is called, the living God in both the Old Testament and the New. So a few examples of that would be Joshua 3 verse 10, Psalm 42, and then in the New Testament, Matthew 16:16, Romans 9:26, and it occurs also throughout Revelation. So back to Ford. She says, quote, because he is the living one, Christ has the power over the resurrection. He passed through death at a definite moment of history, but he lives forever. So let me break in here and make a couple comments. So when she said, because he is the living one, that's another deity link, of course, because in the Old Testament, it's Yahweh who is called the living God. So the living one in the Old Testament is Yahweh. The living one in Matthew it's the Father. Peter says, you are the Son of the living God. And so here, Jesus himself is called the living one, the living God. So again, it's a blending of the two powers. The descriptions of God are used as descriptions of Christ. So again, Christ is God. And I also find it interesting, Ford was Catholic. So just something that I thought was curious, when she makes the comment, he passed through death at a definite moment of history, but he lives forever. So what she's saying is he died one time. But yet in the Catholic Mass, they always carry him around as though he's on the cross. So I don't know if at that point, Ford's scholarship, she knew that, he passed through death once, but then in the Mass, it's always portrayed as he's on the cross. I thought that was curious statement coming from a Catholic scholar. So let's continue here with Ford. Back to Ford. She said, I'm going to just start again because the next sentence where I left off, we need the previous one. She says, quote, he passed through death at a definite moment of history, but he lives forever. Hence, he has the keys of death and Sheol, and can accordingly guarantee the faithful a sharing in his resurrection, end quote. And Ford links the keys of death and Sheol to Matthew 16:19, which is when Jesus is talking to Peter about the keys to bind and loose, the keys of the kingdom of heaven to bind and loose. Now, I agree with her. I think that the keys that he mentions in Matthew 16 are linked to the keys of death and Sheol. And we're going to have a separate study where we go through the keys of death and Sheol. But I thought that was a good connection where Ford makes that, linking the keys there back to Matthew 16:19. And it's a spiritual warfare issue. The keys of the kingdom to bind and loose is a spiritual warfare statement that Jesus is making. So we'll talk about that in our next study. So Jesus' death was once; it was in the past, and that's what Ford is saying. But Jesus' life is endless. So John 5:26, Jesus said, "Just as the Father has life in Himself, so He has granted the Son to have life in Himself." And the statement "alive forevermore" also focuses on the fullness of the life He now lives. And as Ford noted, Jesus' life guarantees life for His own. As it says, as Jesus said in John 10:10, "I came so that they could have life." And they, in John 10:10, are His own. I came that they could have life, indeed, so they could live life to the fullest. Beale also comments on this, the one who lives forever and ever. Beale says, quote, "For Christ to say that He is the living..." Let me start again. Beale, quote, "For Christ to say that He is the one living unto the ages of the ages is another ascription of deity, since this was a repeated phrase for God in the Old Testament." So there we go again. Beale agrees with Ford that when it says that when John records Jesus as saying that "I am the living one," it's an ascription of deity. So how many times have we had in Revelation 1 so far ascriptions of deity to Christ? It's more than I could count off the top of my head. It's a lot. That's the point of Revelation 1. Jesus, one of the points at least. Jesus is God. He's the God of Israel incarnate. He's linked with the Ancient of Days. He is the Ancient of Days according to what we talked about in our study back in verse 13 to 14. So there's just another example of it here. And Beale links that with, when he said that it was a repeated phrase for God in the Old Testament, he links Deuteronomy 32:40. He links Daniel 4:34 in the Greek text known as Theodotion. He also links Daniel 12:7, and he links Sirach 18:1. I'm going to read Sirach 18:1, and it's the English translation of the Greek manuscript Vaticanus. It says, "The one who lives forever created everything in a common fashion." So when we get to the New Testament and we read Paul and John in John chapter 1, that Christ created everything. The Word created everything that was created, and He became incarnate. So Sirach says the one who lives forever created everything. So Paul and John, who would have been well aware of these Second Temple writings, the one who lives forever created everything. Jesus created everything. He's the one who lives forever. He's God. So there's all kinds of different ways that we can understand the New Testament to be communicating the deity of Christ. And I'm a fan of all of them. So there's another one here. So John is claiming this title again for Jesus. "As Yahweh lives" is a famous Old Testament oath formula. The prophets use it all the time. Elijah, "As Yahweh lives before whom I stand," and then he'll go on to make his statements. The same thing is in view here. As I said, John is standing in the council. "As Yahweh lives," and he's standing right in front of John. So John is then going to be commissioned in the same way as Elijah to impart the words that the living one gives him to speak. And in Daniel 4:34, the Most High is the one who lives forever. So again, I did a study on El Elyon, which is the Hebrew God Most High, that you could go listen to for more on that. And the Palestinian Targum of Deuteronomy 28:11 and 12 asserts that God alone holds the key of life and of the tombs. So that is going to be a segue right there for our next study, which is going to be on the keys of death and Sheol. The Palestinian Targum, Deuteronomy 28, God alone holds the key of life and of the tombs. And here, as we're going to see, Jesus is the one holding the keys to Sheol and to death and Sheol. But that's going to be a long study, so I'm going to save it for a separate teaching. So for now, I'll say thank you all for listening. God bless, and I'll talk to you all very soon.